He broke the law to hide an orc girl from soldiers. Her gratitude wasn't what he expected. "Do not move," she said, her voice cracking. "The soldiers are close." Mud swallowed her to the waist, where the collapsed embankment had buried her, one massive arm pinned beneath splintered timber. Blood matted the fur at her shoulder. Dark and steaming, her breath coming in short. Controlled bursts. A woman fighting panic and losing slowly. Alone with no one for miles to hear her, Ethan dropped his fishing rod and ran anyway, mud soaking through his patched boots. He'd heard stories about orcs his whole life. None of them mentioned eyes like that. Frightened, furious, ashamed to be seen this way. As though weakness were worse than being found at all. He worked the timber loose with his bare hands, ignoring her warning growls, ignoring every warning he'd ever been raised on. Torn beneath the mud on her collar, he caught a flash of gold thread, the kind no traveler could afford. And somewhere far off, faint but unmistakable, the sound of riders searching for something they had lost. He had no idea whose life he'd just saved, or what it would cost him. Before you go any further, hit that bell icon, so you never miss what happens when two worlds collide. Stay until the end. This story earns every minute of it. The River Riverdale ran low that autumn, and Ethan Walker had learned to read its moods the way other men read scripture. He lived where the water bent hard around a stand of black pine, in a cabin his father had built with his own hands before a fever took him one bitter winter and left Ethan, at 19, alone with a roof that leaked and a debt he never asked for. That had been 11 years ago. He was 30 now, and the roof still leaked, patched with tar and stubbornness, but it kept the worst of the rain off the single room where he slept. Ate and mended nets by firelight. He had not always lived alone. He had been the second son of a blacksmith once, and for a time his life had followed an ordinary shape, apprenticeship, expectation. A girl named Emily he had loved since childhood and assumed he would marry. But his father's forge failed the year Ethan turned 18, undercut by a rival with better connections and looser scruples. And the family scattered the way poor families do when the ground gives way beneath them. His father took the failure hard, and harder still the fever that followed. His mother went to live with a sister in the capital. His older brother took the king's coin and marched off to a border skirmish and never marched back. Emily waited a year for a future that no longer seemed to be coming, and then she married the merchant's son, who could offer her a roof that did not leak. Ethan heard the news while he was still digging his father's grave, and he never quite forgave the small, ugly part of him that had hated her for it, even knowing she owed him nothing. He had come to the Riverdale with his father's old tools and a grief he did not know how to put down, and he built the cabin himself badly at first, better with time. He learned about the river. He learned to be alone in a way that did not feel like punishment most days. What he had not learned, what he had never expected to learn, was what to do when a woman built like a mountain, dressed in torn leathers finer than anything he had ever touched, lay half buried in the mud, not 200 paces from his own door. He did not ask who she was before he pulled her free. He got his shoulder under her good arm and hauled her toward his cabin as the light failed, because whatever had put her in that embankment might still be hunting her. And a woman that wounded would not survive a night in the open. She did not thank him. She stared instead, mud-streaked and bleeding, breathing hard. And when he finally had her by the fire and her arm wrapped in the cleanest linen he owned, she demanded to know his name, as though she meant to remember it for later. For accounting one way or another, he told her. Ethan, he said. Just Ethan. She asked why a man alone in the woods would risk soldiers, whoever they were, for a stranger who might well be a monster in every story his own people told. He told her the truth, that he could not have watched her die and lived with himself after, and that whatever she was, she had not looked like a monster lying in that mud. She looked like someone in pain. She said nothing to that. But she did not sleep that night, and neither, watching her from the floor by the dying fire. Did he? Her name, though she would not offer it for many days, was Riley Blackwood, and she had been born to lead before she learned to walk without falling. Her mother had ruled the Blackridge clanhold as war-matriarch for 30 years, and Riley had been raised in the certainty that she would inherit both the strength and the burden of it. She had led her first war band at 19. She had buried her mother at 26, alone in front of the whole clanhold, forbidden by custom from weeping where anyone could see. She had worn the war-matriarch's collar every day since, through 7 years of holding a fractious clan together by will and by force, and she had learned, long before she ever set foot in Westmore, that weakness in a woman who ruled alone was an open invitation to anyone hungry enough to take what she held. There had been, too, a man once promised to her, Connor Steele, a chieftain's son from an allied clan, betrothed to her in the old political way before either of them was old enough to have an opinion about it. She had never loved him, though she had tried, in the dutiful way rulers try to love the things given to them rather than chosen. Connor had wanted the alliance more than he had ever wanted her, and when her mother died, and the betrothal lapsed under clan law rather than being formally renewed, he had taken the insult personally, certain some rival had turned her against him. He had not forgotten it, and his pride, Riley would later understand, had made him fertile ground for ambitions far worse than his own. Her cousin, Sidious, had wanted the war-matriarch's collar since they were children sparring in the training yards, and he had spent years telling himself his hunger for it was really love for the clan, that he alone understood what needed to be done, that Riley's caution toward the human kingdoms was weakness dressed up as wisdom. He had built his following slowly, patiently, the way a man builds a siege rather than a raid, and when he finally struck, he did not do it with an army. He did it with poison in her wine and blades in the dark for the guards loyal enough to warn her. She had escaped with 3 of her own, and all 3 had died buying her the miles that finally put the border and a collapsed riverbank between her and her cousin's knives. She had never in 29 years been so powerless. And she had never, until a poor human with mud to his elbows pulled her free asking nothing in return, been helped by anyone who did not want something from her in exchange. The first days between them were careful, the way 2 wary animals circle. Ethan gave her his cot and slept on the floor, and Riley, watching him do it without complaint, could not make sense of the gesture. In her world, comfort was claimed by strength, never surrendered to a stranger. He cooked for her, thin stews seasoned with garden herbs, and she found, to her private astonishment, that she preferred it to every silver-plated feast her hall had ever offered. He asked nothing of her, not her name, not her story, not why a woman wearing a war-matriarch's collar had been left for dead in a human riverbank. He simply tended her wound morning and evening, unhurried, and let her decide in her own time what she wished to give away. That patience unsettled her more than any interrogation could have. The first crack in her guard came on the 4th night, when a barn owl shrieked outside, and Ethan startled so badly he knocked over a water jug and swore with a thoroughness that undid him completely. Riley laughed before she could stop herself, low, rough, entirely unguarded, and looked immediately mortified, as though she had confessed something far more dangerous than amusement. Ethan, righting the jug, only smiled and said he was glad his suffering could be of some use to someone. She told him, once the laughter had faded, that in her hall no one laughed at a leader's expense and lived comfortably after. He asked whether that meant she wanted an apology. She said it meant the opposite, though she did not explain further, and he decided wisely not to press. The days that followed grew easier, though never simple. She began teaching him words in her own tongue, starting with the ones that mattered most to her people. She said the word for home first, low and guttural, and told him to repeat it. He mangled it badly enough that she corrected him 3 times before giving up, informing him flatly that he would starve before he mastered pronunciation. He told her in turn that hearth in his language did not mean only fire, but the whole idea of a place that waited for you. And she repeated the word back to him twice, slower the second time. As though she were turning it over to see what it was worth, she offered to spar with him one afternoon to keep her strength from wasting while she healed, and was baffled when he flushed red and stammered that it wasn't proper for a lady to fight a woodcutter. She asked him, entirely without malice, whether he thought her arm would break simply because he was watching. He said that wasn't what he meant at all. She told him she knew exactly what he meant, and that his modesty was going to be the death of him one day, and he laughed despite himself because there was no unkindness in the way she said it. There were smaller misunderstandings, too. She once asked him plainly why human men hid their bodies beneath so much cloth even in their own homes, as though strength was something to be ashamed of. And he went red to his ears and mumbled something about modesty that made no sense to her at all. He, in turn, was baffled the first time she skinned a rabbit with her bare hands at his table rather than waiting for him to do it, certain for one confused moment that she meant it as some kind of challenge. Before understanding, she simply saw no reason to wait on a task she was faster at than he was. There was, too, the matter of names, which caused more confusion between them than either expected. She told him one evening that her people did not name children lightly, that a name was chosen only once a child had shown some quality worth honoring, and that infants went unnamed sometimes for a full year, while parents watched to see what the world had given them. He admitted in turn that he had been named for a grandfather he never met, a man remembered mostly for having died owing money to half the village, and that he had spent his childhood wondering whether he'd been handed a debt along with the name. She told him, with the particular bluntness he had come to expect from her, that whatever debt the name once carried, he had clearly paid it off by now, several times over, and he laughed longer at that than the joke probably deserved, mostly from the relief of being told plainly that he was not the sum of what his family had failed to be. By the second week, something had shifted that neither of them named. She chopped wood despite his protests, with an ease that left him staring, impressed and faintly wounded in his pride at once. He began asking her opinion on small things, where to set a snare, whether Frost would take the last of the turnips, not because he needed the answer, but because he wanted to hear it. One night, unable to sleep, she asked him what he missed most from the life he'd had before the forge failed, before Emily, before any of it. He thought about it for a long while, the fire popping between them, before admitting that he missed being expected somewhere, the particular feeling of a place holding a space for him, a chair at a table, a name someone would call out if he did not arrive. She was quiet at that, turning her own collar over in her hands, the metal catching firelight. She told him that she had never once lacked a place people expected her, and had never once, until these past days, been asked to arrive anywhere as herself rather than as the collar she wore. He asked whether that made this cabin, mud floor and leaking roof and all, the first place in her life anyone had wanted only her company. She did not answer in words. She only looked at him long enough that he understood the answer regardless, and looked away first, embarrassed by how much the silence had said. It was in the second week, too, that the first real argument between them happened. And it surprised them both with how quickly it turned sharp. Riley's wound had healed enough, by her own judgment, to test with real effort, and she rose one morning while Ethan was still asleep and went to split the last of the winter wood herself, favoring her bad arm no more than she absolutely had to. He woke to the sound of the axe and came outside half-dressed and furious with fear rather than anger, telling her the wound was not healed, that she could tear it open again, that she had no business risking herself over firewood. He could split himself in half the time it would cost her to heal wrong. She told him, flatly, that she had led war bands with worse wounds than this one, and that she would not be coddled in his cabin like some fragile human bride kept indoors for her own protection. He said that was not what he meant, and she said it was exactly what he meant, whether he understood it or not. And for a moment the old fear in her, the fear of being managed, of being handled the way her own advisors had always tried to handle her, rose up hot and ugly and found him standing in front of her instead of them. He did not back down, though his voice shook when he told her that he was not trying to manage her, that he had buried a father and a brother and had no intention of watching someone else he cared for bleed out over pride. Hers or anyone's, the word cared for hung between them a moment too long, and something in her anger cracked open at it, though she was too proud to let it show all at once. She lowered the axe. She told him, quieter now, that she was not used to being cared for by anyone who did not also want something from her in return, and that she did not know yet what to do with wanting nothing but her safety in exchange. He told her she did not have to know what to do with it. She only had to let it be true. They did not speak much for the rest of that day, but that evening she let him check the wound without protest, and when his hands were gentle against the half-healed skin, she found herself watching his face rather than his fingers, and did not look away when he noticed. Mornings after that took on a shape neither of them commented on, but both came to rely upon. He rose first always, to build up the fire before the cold could settle into the room, and she woke to the sound of him doing it. She began, in turn, rising before him some mornings to have water heated for his hands, stiff and cracked from network in the cold river, and the first time he found the kettle already warm, and her watching him, with an expression she could not quite disguise as indifference, he understood that they had begun, without either of them declaring it, to take care of each other in the small, unglamorous ways that mattered more than any grand gesture could. One evening, mending a shirt sleeve while she watched, he told her plainly that he had never once, in 11 years alone by that river, imagined telling anyone the things he had told her, not because the memories were secret, but because he had never trusted anyone enough to hand them over. She asked why he trusted her now, a stranger from a people his own kingdom had fought a war against within living memory. He thought about it longer than she expected before answering. He said it was not really about trust in the way she meant it. It was that she had never once, in all their careful days together, tried to make her pain smaller to spare his feelings, and he had never once, in his whole life, met anyone who offered him that same honesty first. She was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. Then she told him that where she came from, honesty was considered a kind of weapon. You offered it to people you respected enough to trust with the damage it could do. She said she had not meant to hand him a weapon that first week. She had simply run out of the strength it took to hide one, he asked, half teasing to soften the weight of the moment, whether that made him dangerous now, knowing so much about her. She said it made him the only person in either world who could hurt her, and had chosen, every day since, not to. He did not have an answer for that. He only reached over, and for the first time without hesitation, brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face, and she let him, and neither of them pretended. Afterward, that the moment had not meant exactly what it felt like it meant. It was in the third week that the village nearly ruined everything without ever meaning to. Ethan walked into Riverbend for salt and nails, leaving Riley reluctantly hidden in the cabin, and found Emily there at the market stalls, her merchant husband 3 years dead of a winter fever, a child on her hip, and grief still fresh enough to soften the old wound between them. She asked kindly enough whether he was well, whether he had found anyone since, and he answered honestly that his life had grown strange and full in ways he could not yet explain. A gossiping neighbor saw them speaking, saw Emily's hand briefly on his arm in old, easy familiarity, and by the time the story reached the tavern that evening, it had grown into something else entirely. That the hermit fisherman was courting the widow after all these years, that perhaps he had a woman hidden at his cabin already and meant to have both. The rumor reached Riley before Ethan did, carried by a trader who mentioned it thinking nothing of it. Riley said nothing when Ethan returned, salt and nails in hand, cheerful in a way that only deepened the hurt already settling in her chest. She asked him, with a coolness he did not understand, whether he had enjoyed his walk to the village. He said he had, and asked why she wanted to know. She said it did not matter. in the tone of someone for whom it very much mattered, and he spent the better part of an hour confused and increasingly worried before a careless comment from him about needing more nails from the smith by Emily's stall finally made her demand outright who this Emily was and why the whole village seemed to think he meant to marry her. He laughed before he could stop himself, which did not help his case at all, and had to explain, quickly and with real feeling, that Emily had married someone else a decade ago and buried him besides, and that nothing between them remained but old, faded history and an afternoon's civil conversation. He told her, more seriously then, that he had spent 11 years believing no one would ever choose him over an easier life, and that watching her believe the same fear about him, however briefly, only proved how much they had both been taught to expect the worst from love before they ever met each other. Riley was not entirely soothed by words alone. Pride, once wounded, healed slower in her than in him, but she let him hold her that night regardless, and admitted, quietly, that she had not known jealousy could feel so much like grief before it turned out to be nothing. The same trader who had carried the village rumor to Riley's ears carried something else with him that night that neither of them paid proper attention to at the time. Talk from the eastern road of soldiers moving in unusual numbers along the Crown's border watch. Word passed down from the capital that the old treaty with the Blackridge clan was to be reviewed come spring, and that certain lords at court had not forgotten the last Orc War and would welcome an excuse to refight it on more favorable terms. Ethan thought little of it beyond a farmer's idle unease at soldiers on the move. He did not yet know how closely his own kingdom watched the clanhold he would soon call home, nor how thin the peace between both peoples truly was, held together by little more than old exhaustion and a treaty neither side much trusted. It was a small thing, mentioned once and forgotten by morning, but it would not stay forgotten forever. If this story has you leaning forward already, this is the moment to press that hype button, because everything that follows is about to test whether what they've found can survive what's coming for both of them. It found them on the 18th day. Ethan heard hoofbeats on the forest track at dusk, hard and disciplined, and had one breath to shove Riley toward the root cellar he had dug years ago and never once needed for anything more urgent than potatoes. She did not go easily. He gripped her hand the first time he had simply taken it rather than tended it, and told her that if she cared for him at all, she would let him protect her this once. Something in his voice broke through. She went. The riders were not soldiers of the Crown, but Sidious's own scouts, sweeping the border villages for any sign of the war-matriarch who had escaped his blades. Ethan answered their questions with the flat patience of a man who truly had nothing to hide, and after a tense quarter hour, they rode on, unsatisfied. When he lifted the floorboards, Riley emerged pale and shaking, and something in her broke open at last. She told him everything. Her name, her rank, the collar and what it meant. When she came to the part about the poison in her wine, her hands, steady through every hour of tending a wound and every night of quiet conversation, began to tremble so badly she had to fold them together to still them, and her voice, always so carefully formal, cracked in a way Ethan had not heard from her once in 18 days. She told him about the 3 guards who had died buying her the miles to the border, said their names aloud, slowly, as though speaking them was the only funeral rite she had been able to give them. She told him of Connor and the old betrothal, because she did not want even that small omission sitting between them any longer. Ethan listened in a silence that stretched too long. When he finally spoke, it was not what she expected. He asked whether any of it, the meals, the laughter, the nights by the fire, had been real, or whether he had simply been useful to a queen in hiding, a place to disappear until it was safe to be herself again. The question wounded her worse than any blade, because she understood with sudden clarity that she had given him every reason to ask it. She told him, more honestly than she had ever spoken to anyone, that none of it had been performance, that she had told no one else the truth of her escape. that she had slept easier in his leaking cabin than in her own hall in 7 years, and that she had been afraid, simply afraid, that the truth would change how he looked at her. And now, watching the hurt still sitting in his eyes, she feared it already had. He did not answer at once. Pride or fear or the old wound of feeling forever lesser made him step back instead of forward. And he told her, low and unsteady, that a woodcutter had no business standing this close to a queen's fire, and that perhaps it was best if she moved on when she was able. She asked whether he meant that, or whether he was simply frightened enough to say it and hoped she would argue him out of it. He did not answer, and his silence was not enough. She left that night, wounded arm and all, too proud to argue and too hurt to stay where she believed she was no longer wanted. Ethan let her go and told himself it was for the best, and did not sleep at all. He had perhaps 3 hours to regret it before the world made the choice for both of them. Sidious's scouts doubled back before dawn on a stray rumor from a neighboring farm, and this time they did not ride on. They found Ethan alone, a spear at his throat, demanding the war-matriarch's location before he had finished waking. He did not have to lie. He genuinely did not know where she had gone in the dark, but the not knowing did not loosen the blade pressed against his skin, nor spare him the understanding, arriving late and cruel, that his pride had sent the woman he loved into the very danger he had once risked everything to pull her from. Riley had not gone far. She heard the riders. She saw the spear at his throat through the grey morning light. And every instinct that had kept her alive through 7 years of rule rose at once, absolute and unanswerable. She would not let him die for her mistake. She came out of the tree line like something out of the old war stories still told to frighten children, and for the first time Ethan saw exactly what she had always been beneath the wounds in the borrowed shirt. A war-matriarch of the Blackridge clan, unbowed and terrible and magnificent. She fought with a ferocity that scattered the scouts within minutes, though not without cost. A blade opened her side before the last man fled, and she staggered rather than stood once the fighting was done. Blood dark against her borrowed clothes, for the second time since Ethan had known her. He caught her before she fell, and this time it was his hands shaking, not hers. He told her, voice raw, that he did not care what she was, queen or commoner, or cohuman, that he had fallen for the woman who laughed at his clumsiness and cried out in her sleep and asked nothing of him but honesty, and that sending her away out of his own foolish pride had frightened him more than any spear at his throat ever could. She told him, bleeding and breathless, that no title, no collar, no clanhold had ever made her feel as truly seen as he had these past weeks, and that she had fallen for him somewhere between the turnip stew and the mangled pronunciation of her own tongue, though she had been too afraid to say so until this exact, blood-soaked morning. He asked, half laughing despite everything, whether that meant he was forgiven for being an idiot the night before. She said it meant he had exactly one more chance, and that she intended to hold him to it for the rest of both their lives. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. They did not need to. Her captain found them 3 days later. Brenda had spent those 3 days combing the border hills, half mad with worry, and her relief at finding her war-matriarch alive warred openly with her fury at finding her so thoroughly wounded, and standing altogether too close to a human man for propriety. She was a broad, scarred orc, 20 years Riley's senior, who had served the war-matriarch's mother before her and had carried Riley on her shoulders as a child through the training yards. And she did not soften her opinions for anyone, least of all a human she had never met. She looked Ethan over, the way she might inspect a horse she suspected of lameness, and asked Riley flatly whether the human had at least proven himself useful. Given that he had apparently gotten her stabbed twice in 3 weeks, Ethan stung, pointed out that he had also pulled her out of a collapsed riverbank and fought off armed scouts with nothing but a woodsman's knowledge of the terrain. Brenda said that remained to be seen, and that she would decide for herself once she had watched him hold a spear, without embarrassing the both of them. It was, though Ethan did not know it yet, the closest thing to approval Brenda ever gave anyone on first meeting. Her report was worse than either of them had feared. Sidious had used Riley's absence to move against the last of her loyalists in the clanhold itself. Two of her oldest advisors, men who had served her mother before her, had been executed on invented charges of treason. Worse still, Sidious had gone to Connor Steele's clan seeking soldiers, offering the old betrothal renewed as the price of aid, a marriage to be forced upon Riley the moment Sidious's coup was secure. Whether she lived to consent to it or not, Riley received the news with the composure of a leader, even in a dead woman's borrowed shirt. But Ethan, standing close enough to see it, watched the color drain entirely from her face at the names of the dead advisors, watched her hands curl into fists at her sides, hard enough that her knuckles paled, and understood for the first time exactly how much that composure cost her to maintain. At the mention of Connor's bargain, something colder moved behind her eyes, not fear of the man himself, but a fury Ethan recognized uncomfortably as an echo of his own old wound, the fear of being valued only for what one could offer rather than who one was. She turned to him after, and in front of her captain, in front of the weight of everything her answer would cost her, she made her offer plainly, in the blunt manner her people valued above all human courtship. She asked him to return with her, not as a prisoner, not as a curiosity, but as her chosen partner, standing beside her before her clan and her enemies both. She promised him no easy life, only her honesty, her protection, and a place at her side that no one, not Sidious, not Connor, not tradition itself, would be permitted to take from him without going through her first. And she told him, because it mattered to her more than the offer itself, that he was free to refuse. He asked what would happen to her if he said no. She told him, honestly, that she would go back regardless and fight for her clanhold regardless, because it was hers to fight for whether or not he stood beside her. But she said it would be easier and truer and infinitely less lonely if he chose to stand there anyway. He did not answer immediately. He walked the riverbank alone that night, turning over 11 years of solitude and one impossible month that had cracked it wide open, thinking of Emily, who had chosen safety over uncertainty, thinking of the boy in the river ice, thinking finally of Riley laughing at his clumsiness with a sound entirely unguarded and entirely real. He understood, somewhere before dawn, that he had already lost enough in his life to know the difference between fear of change and fear of regret, and that this was the second kind. He found her at first light and told her he did not want her kingdom, only her, and was terrified in ways he had no words for, but would rather face every impossible thing waiting on the other side of that choice than spend the rest of his life wondering what he had given up out of fear. They sealed it there, forehead to forehead, in a gesture Brenda later explained was older than the clanhold itself. I stand where you stand now. It was not a grand thing. It was quieter than that and truer for it. The road back to Blackridge took 4 days, and Brenda used every one of them to make good on her promise. She woke Ethan before dawn each morning and set him to drills with a blunted spear, correcting his footing with a bark that made him flinch the first day and merely wince by the fourth. She told him, without much patience, that a man standing beside a war-matriarch would be watched by every enemy she had, and that watchmen who could not hold a weapon properly tended not to live long enough to matter. He asked, sweating and sore on the third morning, whether she disapproved of him. She said that disapproval was not the word. She said she had buried enough people Riley loved to have run out of patience for liking anyone before she knew whether they would survive to be worth the grief. Ethan did not have an answer for that, and Brenda, seeing it land, allowed herself something almost like a smile before ordering him to run the drill again. They arrived at Blackridge on the evening of the 4th day, and the clanhold gave them a welcome feast before anyone had decided whether Ethan deserved one, a matter of formality rather than favor, Victoria explained to him quietly. The sort of hospitality owed to any guest at a war-matriarch's table, regardless of what the council might later rule about his right to stay. Ethan sat at Riley's side through course after course of food richer than anything he had tasted in his life, uneasy under the weight of 100 unfamiliar stares, and did his best not to embarrass either of them. It was near the end of the meal that he first felt it, a strange bitterness beneath the sweetness of the spiced wine, faint enough that he might have dismissed it as simply foreign to his tongue. If 11 years of foraging feverwort and yarrow along the Riverdale hadn't trained his senses to notice exactly that kind of wrongness in anything he put in his mouth. He set the cup down without drinking further and said nothing at first, not wanting to make a scene at a table where he was already the least welcome guest. But the bitterness lingered on his tongue in a way plain wine never did, and a memory surfaced from some half-forgotten lesson his mother had given him as a boy. Foraging together before the forge failed and everything after it fell apart. A warning about a root called widow's throat, bitter and nearly undetectable in strong wine, used by poachers to fell wolves quietly rather than draw attention with a blade. He had seen it once dried and bundled in the healer's stores at Marrow's Bend. He was seeing its ghost now in his own cup. He caught Brenda's eye down the table rather than raise an alarm that might get someone killed before the truth was known, and told her low enough that only she and Riley could hear, that something in his wine was wrong, and that if he was right, whoever had poured it likely meant it for the war-matriarch's table generally, rather than for one human specifically, since no one at that feast could have known in advance which cup would end up in his hands rather than hers. Riley's face did not change for the benefit of the hall, but her hand found him beneath the table, gripping hard enough to bruise. Brenda moved without hurry, the practiced calm of a woman who had spent decades not giving enemies the satisfaction of seeing her alarmed, and quietly had every cup at the high table collected rather than refilled. Citing some minor ceremonial excuse, the hall accepted without much thought. The clan's own healer confirmed it within the hour, in a private chamber far from curious ears, widow's throat, exactly as Ethan had guessed, present in 3 of the 7 cups collected. Though not tellingly in Riley's own, whoever had arranged it had been careful enough, or frightened enough, not to risk being tied directly to the war-matriarch's death, and had aimed instead at unsettling her table, or perhaps at the human guest specifically, hoping a dead outsider might quietly resolve the argument the council had not yet finished having. No proof pointed cleanly at Connor or at Sidious's remaining loyalists, though suspicions settled heavily on both, and neither man was foolish enough to have left a trail Brenda's people could follow to his door. Victoria, informed of the matter before the council convened the next morning, studied Ethan for a long moment with an expression he could not read, and told him at last that a human who could recognize widow's throat by taste alone, in the wine no orc at that table had noticed anything wrong with, had earned rather more of her attention than his fishing rod and his patched boots had first suggested. She did not thank him outright, that was not her way, but she made certain quietly and without fanfare that the tasters assigned to the war-matriarch's table from that evening forward were instructed to trust his palate as much as their own training, which Brenda later told him was as close to an official commendation as Victoria had given anyone in a decade. Riley said little about it that night, holding his hand tighter than usual as they finally found a moment alone, until she admitted, quietly, that the thought of losing him to something as small and cowardly as poison in a cup, after everything both of them had already survived to reach this hall, frightened her more than any blade raised openly against her ever had. He told her that 11 years of foraging beside a father who taught him to notice what didn't belong had finally proven good for something more than turnip stew, and she managed a tired laugh at that, though her grip on his hand did not loosen for the rest of the night. The clan hold did not welcome him. Sidious, cornered now that Riley had returned with her captain's loyalty restored and evidence of his executions laid bare before the council, seized on Ethan's presence as the last weapon he had left. He called for open challenge before the full assembly, declaring that no war-matriarch who shared her heart with a human and had let 2 loyal advisors die for her absence could be trusted with the collar at all. Connor stood beside him at the challenge, still smarting from years of old humiliation, insisting loudly that the betrothal his own father had sworn to Riley's mother had never truly lapsed, only been ignored, and that honor demanded it still be answered, with the human sent back across the border where he belonged. Or worse, Ethan, who had never led anything grander than a fishing line, stood before a hall of orc elders who could have crushed him with a look and answered with the only currency he possessed. He spoke of pulling their war-matriarch from a collapsed riverbank without knowing her name, because he could not have lived with himself otherwise. He spoke of watching her fight to protect a stranger who had, in his own fear, sent her away first. He did not claim strength to match theirs, or wealth to match hers, only a willingness to earn his place one honest day at a time. The way he had earned every small thing in a hard life. One of the eldest council members, a scarred matriarch named Victoria, who had served beside Riley's mother in her youth, asked him plainly whether he understood what he was asking to become part of. She asked whether he understood that her people had fought his own kind within living memory, that they buried their dead facing east in mourning for a war neither side had ever properly ended, and that he would be looked at for the rest of his days and seen first as the shape of an old enemy before anyone troubled to see the man standing in front of them. Ethan did not flinch from the question. He answered that he understood loss well enough to know it did not excuse cruelty forever, and that he would rather be judged fairly by strangers slow to trust him than spend one more year being judged unfairly by no one at all, alone by his river, with nothing left to prove himself against. Victoria asked what he would do the first time one of her people spat at his feet and called him a coward's peace offering. He said he would still be standing there the next morning, because leaving had never once solved anything in his life, only delayed the grief of it. A younger elder, seated near the back of the hall, asked more quietly whether he understood that even if the council accepted him, most of the clanhold's ordinary folk, the farmers, the smiths, the guards who had lost kin in the last war, would take far longer to forgive what they might see as a betrayal in their own war-matriarch's house. Ethan said he did not expect forgiveness handed to him on the strength of one speech. He said he only asked for the chance to earn it the same slow way he had earned everything else worth having, and that he intended to still be earning it decades from now. Long after anyone in the hall had stopped keeping count, Victoria studied him for a long moment and said nothing further. But Riley, watching from beside the council dais, saw the old matriarch's expression shift from suspicion into something closer to respect, and knew it mattered more than any speech he could have given. When Connor sneered that words were cheap and asked what a human could possibly offer a war matriarch that an orc of proper blood could not, Ethan answered quietly that he could offer her the one thing no betrothal built on old pride had ever given her: the freedom to be tired, or frightened, or simply herself, without fear of what it would cost her standing. The hall went very still at that. It was Brenda who finally tipped the room, testifying gruffly to what she had seen on the road home, a war matriarch steadier and more herself than in years, and a human who had bled to protect her when he had every reason to let her go. She said she had trained soldiers for 20 years who held a spear worse than this human did after 4 days, and that will count for more than blood in her experience. Whatever the old songs claimed, the council did not embrace him, and Sidious's faction did not simply dissolve, but enough elders refused to back the challenge to its conclusion, and Sidious' support cracked apart with it. Connor, humiliated before the assembly a second time in his life by the same woman, withdrew from the hall in a silence more dangerous than any outburst. And Riley, watching him go, understood that his pride had not been satisfied, only postponed. There was, too, a complication neither of them had anticipated. A crown envoy arrived at the Clanhold gates not 3 days after the challenge. Sent from Westmore's capital on the strength of the same rumours the trader had carried west, word that the war-matriarch of Blackridge had taken a human consort, and that certain lords wished to know whether this meant new leverage over the border treaty or new grounds to declare it broken. The envoy, a cold, careful man named Adrian Reynolds, made clear in his measured, courtly way that the crown considered a human living among orcs a matter of some delicacy, and asked, with a politeness that did not disguise the threat beneath it, whether Ethan understood that his choice might be read by some in the capital as treason against his own people. Ethan answered him the same way he had answered the council, plainly, without flourish. He said he had sworn no oath to any crown that had ever fed him, housed him, or noticed his existence beyond collecting the taxes he could barely afford, and that he did not consider loyalty a debt owed automatically to the accident of where a man was born. He said if the crown wished to call that treason, it could take the matter up with him directly rather than through threats delivered second-hand at another people's gate. Reynolds did not care for the answer, but he had no immediate grounds to act on it, and he left with vague warnings about matters best watched carefully, which Riley took seriously enough to double the border patrols for the rest of that season. It was a small storm compared to the one Sidious had already brought down on them, but it taught Ethan something he had not fully understood before, that his choice to stay had not simply cost him his old life. It had made him, whether he wanted the role or not, a thread in the treaty holding two kingdoms apart from war, and he would need to learn to carry that weight as carefully as Riley carried her collar. She was right to fear Connor's postponed pride. However, more than any envoy's veiled threats, 2 nights later, with nothing left to lose in the council chamber, Sidious and the remnant of Connor's soldiers struck at the Clanhold gates in the dark, no longer for the throne, but for ruin itself, for the destruction of everything both men believed had been stolen from them. The alarm horn sounded before Ethan had even finished pulling on his boots. He found the yard already alight with torches and screaming, the smell of pitch smoke thick in the cold air. Orcs he had shared meals with 3 nights before, now bleeding against the packed earth, or standing over the bleeding with blades still raised. He had no business in a fight like that, and he knew it, and he went anyway, because staying behind a locked door while Riley fought had never once, in his whole life, been a thing he could make himself do. He found her near the gate, holding a line against 3 of Connor's men with a ferocity that should have reassured him and instead terrified him, because he could see, even from a distance, that exhaustion was beginning to slow her guard. He shouted her name, and in the half-second her attention flickered toward his voice. One of Sidious's men slipped past the outer line entirely, blade raised, angling not for Riley, but for the unguarded space behind her. It was Brenda who saw it first. She had spent 30 years reading a battlefield the way Ethan read a river, and she crossed the distance between herself and her war-matriarch faster than anyone standing there believed an orc her age could move, and put her own body between the blade and the woman she had carried on her shoulders as a child. The sound it made was not the clean, cinematic sound of the old war songs. It was wet and terrible, and much too quiet for what it meant, and Brenda went down without a cry, one hand still closed around the hilt of her own weapon, the other reaching uselessly toward Riley's arm. Riley caught her before she hit the ground. She screamed something in her own tongue, a word Ethan did not know, but understood entirely from the sound of it alone, and the men around them, orc and human alike, seemed for one suspended moment to forget they were fighting at all. Ethan reached them a heartbeat later, dropping to his knees in the mud and blood, pressing his hands uselessly against a wound he already understood, with the flat certainty of a man who had watched his father die slowly. Was beyond any mending his hands could offer. Brenda's breathing came in short, wet pulls. She looked up at Riley, not at the wound, not at the chaos still moving around them, and told, her voice already fading, that she had done exactly what she swore to her mother she would do, and that she would not apologize for it now. Whatever Riley's face was trying to say to stop her, Riley told her she was not permitted to leave like this, that there were still 100 things left to teach her, that she had promised once, long ago, to see Riley crowned and buried both, and had no right to break that promise now over one bad night. Brenda managed something that was almost a laugh, thin and rattling, and said that Riley had been crowned 7 years past, and did not need her standing over her shoulder for the burying, that she trusted the fisherman kneeling in the mud beside them to see to that part instead. Her eyes moved to Ethan then, and she told him, with the last clear strength she had, to take care of her. Not as an order, though it carried the weight of one, but as the only thing she had left to give either of them. Ethan told her he would. He meant it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life. Brenda did not speak again. She held on a few moments more, her hand finding Riley's and gripping it with a strength that startled them both. And then, quietly, without any of the drama the old songs promised, she was simply gone. The fighting around them did not stop for their grief, though it slowed, and Ethan would remember little of what happened in the chaotic half-hour that followed, except that he fought harder than he had ever fought in his life, not for glory or even survival, but because Brenda's hand had still been warm when it went still, and something in him refused to let that be for nothing. Sidious did not survive the night, cut down by his own retreating loyalists once the cause was plainly lost. And Connor fled east before dawn and was never seen in Blackridge lands again, his ambition finally permanently unmade. There was no triumph in either man's ruin for anyone who witnessed it. There was only the exhausted, hollow quiet that follows a war fought inside a single family, a grief too large for any single person to carry alone. Riley did not let go of Brenda's hand until well after sunrise, and Ethan did not leave her side for a moment of it, holding vigil over a woman he had known only a single season but had come. In that season, to understand as one of the few people in either world who had ever simply, uncomplicatedly trusted him, the days after were quiet in a way that felt less like peace than like the world holding its breath. Riley bore the cost of that night the way she bore every cost, with a composure that cracked only when she believed no one was watching. Ethan found her on the outer wall many nights after, staring at a horizon she could not seem to stop searching. And when he asked what she saw there, she admitted for the first time that she feared her own survival had cost too many of the people who had made survival worth having, her mother's advisors, her 3 guards on the border, Brenda most of all. There was one night, worse than the others, when she finally allowed the composure to fail entirely, alone with him where no council or captain or clan elder could see it. She told him she had spent 7 years learning that a war-matriarch who wept in front of her people gave her enemies a weapon, and that she did not know now how to weep in front of anyone at all. Even him, even here, even after everything. He told her she did not have to know how. He only asked her to try once, with no one watching but him. She did, finally, and it was not graceful or quiet the way grief was supposed to look in the old songs. It came out of her in the same raw, unguarded way her laughter once had, and he held her through all of it without once telling her it would be all right. Because he understood, better than most, that some nights the kindest thing a person could offer was simply not to lie. He did not try to argue her out of the grief. He only sat beside her the way she had once sat beside him by a dying fire, while he spoke of a boy he could not save, and let her carry it without carrying it alone, understanding better than most that some wounds did not close so much as they were learned to live around. There were harder nights than that one. She woke twice in the weeks after the battle, certain she could still hear steel on steel in the yard below, and once struck out at him in her sleep before either of them fully understood what was happening. horrified afterward in a way that no reassurance of his could immediately soften. He did not take it as anything other than what it was, a wound that did not show on skin, and he learned, the way he had once learned the river's moods, to wake her gently from a distance rather than by touch, to speak low and steady until her eyes cleared and found him again. She, in turn, learned to recognize the particular quiet that settled over him on the anniversary of his father's death each year, and did not press him to speak of it, only sat near enough that he would know, without needing to ask, that he did not have to carry it alone either. The funeral rites for Brenda, held once the ground had thawed enough to dig properly, brought elders from 3 neighboring clanholds who had known her in her youth, and Riley spoke over her old captain's grave in a voice that did not break. Though Ethan, standing close enough to feel her hand tighten around his, knew exactly what that steadiness cost her. He was asked unexpectedly to speak as well, a human voice at an orc burial being no small thing, and he did, simply saying that he had known Brenda only a single season, and that in that season she had taught him to hold a spear, to hold his tongue when it mattered more than his pride, and to understand that loyalty, real loyalty, asked for nothing in return but the chance to give itself fully. He said her last words to him had been an order disguised as a request, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life obeying it. Victoria told him afterward, gruffly, that it was the finest thing a human had ever said over Blackridge soil, and that she had half a mind to make him repeat it at every council meeting from now on, if only to remind the rest of them what loyalty was supposed to sound like. Victoria became an unlikely presence in their household in the months that followed, arriving unannounced some evenings to share their fire and, more than once, to correct Ethan's clumsy grasp of clan law before he embarrassed himself in front of visiting envoys. She never told him outright that she had come to approve of him, but she stopped calling him the human within his hearing sometime around midwinter, and began instead using the name Riley had given him among her people, Ethan, a small, honorific meaning one who chose to stay. When he asked her, half joking, whether that meant she liked him now, she told him not to push his luck, though the corner of her mouth betrayed her before she managed to hide it. Whenever the story of the poisoned feast came up among the clan's older guards, retold with the small exaggerations such stories always gathered, Victoria was quick to correct the more dramatic versions, insisting flatly that the human had simply had the sense to notice what a careless enemy hadn't bothered to hide well enough. And that sense, however unglamorous, had likely saved more than one life at that table. She told him once, on one of those quiet evenings, about Brenda as a young guard, decades before either of them had been born into the world they now shared. How Brenda had been the only recruit in her cohort who could outmarch the war-matriarch's own mother without complaint. How she'd once carried a wounded scout 11 miles through a snowstorm rather than leave him behind. How she had never once, in 40 years of service, asked for a reward she had not already earned twice over. Ethan listened to every story Victoria was willing to give him, understanding that this, too, was a kind of inheritance, that if he could not have known Brenda longer, he could at least know her better second-hand from the people who had loved her first. Emily's letter reached him that same winter, carried by a trader who knew the border roads, wishing him well in whatever strange new life the village still gossiped about in hushed, half-envious tones, and asking nothing more of him than the friendship of old neighbors who had simply grown into different lives. He read it aloud to Riley by the fire, and she listened without a trace of the old jealousy, only a quiet, private satisfaction at how far both of them had come from the season when a rumor alone had nearly driven them apart. Winter came to the Blackridge Hills the way it once came to the Riverdale, cold and honest, and found them settled into a life neither of them could have imagined a year before. They kept a modest hearth within the clanhold walls, plainer than most of the war-matriarch's household would have chosen, Because Ethan had asked for simplicity, and Riley, who had spent her whole life surrounded by finery that never once made her feel safe, found she preferred it too. He still fished when the weather allowed, in a stream that ran cold and clean through Orc territory, and had taught two of the clan's younger guards to tie a proper net, to their considerable delight. Riley ruled as she always had, fiercely and fairly, though something in her had grown steadier since she had stopped hiding the parts of herself that needed rest, and since she had learned at terrible cost exactly what her people were willing to give for her, and what she was no longer willing to spend carelessly in return. The crown envoy returned once more that winter, colder in his courtesies than before, to inform them formally that the border treaty would stand unaltered for another decade. The capital having decided, after much quiet argument among its lords, that a war fought over one fisherman's choice of wife was not a war worth the coin it would cost. Riley received the news without much reaction, beyond a dry remark to Ethan afterward, that he had apparently succeeded in becoming too small a matter for a kingdom to bother killing him over, which she said was, in its own strange way, the safest thing either of them had accomplished all year. Ethan told her he would take safety in whatever undignified shape it arrived. They spoke of Brenda often, in the easy way people speak of the dead once grief has settled into something closer to memory than wound. And Riley had a place set at the Clanhold's spring feast in her old captain's honor, a custom Ethan had never known among Orcs before, and one that quietly moved him more than any grander ceremony might have. Victoria took to sitting in that place herself some years, when the grief of the empty chair grew too loud for anyone else to bear, and no one begrudged her it. On a quiet evening, not unlike the ones that had first drawn them together, Ethan knelt by their hearth mending a torn strap, while Riley watched from her chair. Her healed wounds nothing now, but faint pale lines she sometimes traced without noticing. She asked him, teasing, whether he remembered the first thing he had ever said to her. Crouched in the mud, with his hands bleeding from splintered wood, he told her he remembered every word of it, easy now. "I have you," and admitted he had not understood even then how completely those words would come to describe the rest of his life. She asked whether he had any regrets, watching him with an expression that was almost, but not quite, uncertain. He told her the only regret he carried was not finding her sooner, and that everything else, every hard night and every grief they had buried together, he would choose again without hesitation, exactly as it had happened. She reached for his hand, and he let the strap fall, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Later, long after the fire had burned low and the strap lay forgotten on the floor between them, she told him one more thing quietly, the way she had learned to say the things that mattered most, plainly, without ornament, the way her people always had. She said that she had spent 29 years believing strength meant needing no one, and that he had taught her without ever once trying to teach her anything, that the two things had never actually been opposites at all. He told her that he had spent 11 years believing loneliness was simply the price of staying safe, and that she had taught him the same lesson from the other direction, that the things worth keeping were never the ones a person could keep alone. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall over the Blackridge hills, soft and silent, settling over two worlds that had once seemed impossible to join, and now, against every old story, every old grief, and every old fear, simply were. She had been a queen who found her home in the last place she ever expected to look. He had been a nobody who found his worth in the one moment he refused to look away. Together, in a world that had told them from the start it could not be done, and had taken so much from them for daring to try, they had chosen each other anyway, and that in the end had been more than enough. If this story moved you, subscribe to Orc Saga for more tales of impossible love across impossible worlds, and let us know in the comments which story we should bring to life next.